Welcome. Thank you for joining today's webinar about the 2020 Census Detailed Demographic and Housing Characteristics File B. Since that's a long name, we'll call it the Detailed DHC-B going forward. I'm Stacy Vidal from the Census Bureau's Public Information Office, and I'm joined by three subject matter experts: Alexandra Kraus, a survey statistician in the Census Bureau's Population Division, Evan Brassell, and Stephanie Galvin. Evan and Stephanie are both from our Social, Economic, and Household Statistics Division, where Stephanie is the Assistant Division Chief for Social Characteristics, and Evan is the Assistant Division Chief for Housing Characteristics. We plan to cover a lot of information today to help you prepare for next week's release. The detailed DHC-B will add to what we've already learned about race and ethnicity from the 2020 census. For example, last year through the detailed DHC-A, we learned about the population size and the number of males and females for approximately 1,500 detailed race and ethnicity groups. With the detailed DHC-B, we'll learn about the households for these same groups. During today's webinar, we'll talk about the groups, geographies, and what household information will be available, along with some guidance for using the data. As we go, feel free to use the Q&A feature to ask questions. We have subject matter experts on standby to answer them. We'll also take questions verbally at the end of our presentation. If we can't get to your question today or you have others, we'll provide some contact information for you to connect with us afterward. So let's dive in. First, some logistics. We'll provide the data on embargo beginning around 10 a.m. on Tuesday, July 30th. We'll lift the embargo at 12:01 a.m. Eastern Time on Thursday, August 1st. The news release will go live on our website at 12:01 a.m., and we expect the data to be live on data.census.gov by 10 a.m. If you would like to register for embargo access, we'll drop the link in the chat along with the login page if you're already a subscriber. Please note that you must be accredited media and must abide by the embargo policy. With that, let me turn it over to Alexandra to give you an overview of the detailed DHC-B. Alexandra?
Thanks, Stacy. I'll give you a few key points to keep in mind about the detailed DHC-B, and then Evan and Stephanie will dive into more details. The detailed DHC-B will share information about the households of detailed race and ethnicity groups and American Indian and Alaska Native tribes and villages. Specifically, it will provide information about their household composition. For example, household type, or whether people live in a family or non-family household. We'll also learn about whether the groups own or rent their homes. We call this tenure. The amount of household information available depends on the size of the group and also the geography. We'll show you what we mean by this in a few moments. Stephanie and Evan will show you what the household type and tenure tables look like and how it varies by the size of your group in a particular geography. But first, let's break each piece of that down. The detailed DHC-B data will be available for the household-only population. If the geography you're interested in only has group quarters, such as college dormitories, military barracks, or prisons, no detailed DHC-B will be available. The detailed DHC-B are available based on the race or ethnicity of the householder. For the 2020 census, the householder is typically the first adult listed in the household census response. We collected data on race and ethnicity in two separate questions following guidelines set by the Office of Management and Budget in 1997. The same 300 detailed race and ethnicity groups that were released in the detailed DHC-A will be available in the detailed DHC-B. That includes 300 detailed race and ethnicity groups in 1,187 American Indian and Alaska Native tribes and villages. Detailed race groups include German, Lebanese, Jamaican, Chinese, Native Hawaiian, and Mexicans, as well as detailed American Indian and Alaska Native tribes and villages like the Navajo Nation and the Native village of Fort Yukon. The data will also include the regional groups included in the detailed DHC-A, such as Middle Eastern and North African and Sub-Saharan African. I've only mentioned some of the largest groups as examples, but you can find the complete list of groups that will be available in the 2020 Census Hispanic Origin and Race Iterations list. We will have a link to it available in the press kit. I'll also note that the detailed DHC-B will provide data for both the race alone population and the race alone or in any combination population. The race alone population represents the minimum number of people who identified as that group. It includes those who reported only one response, such as only Fijian, where the race alone or in any combination population represents the maximum number of people who identified as that group. It includes those who reported only one response, such as Fijian, and those who reported multiple responses, such as Fijian and Japanese, or Fijian and Black or African American. There are a few things to keep in mind if you consider comparing these data to the data from the 2010 census. In terms of race, we made a variety of improvements to how we collected, coded, and tabulated race data this decade. So, for example, we provided dedicated write-in response areas and examples for each major race and ethnicity category. And in consultation with outside experts and stakeholders, we substantially reviewed, updated, and enhanced our race and ethnicity code lists to reflect the various responses that people report. These improvements allowed people to more accurately report their detailed racial and ethnic identities, and they sharpened our collection, coding, and tabulation of disaggregated racial and ethnic groups. We encourage you to check out these resources, a blog that explained last year's detailed DHCA product, and the code list and the crosswalk. To help you become more familiar with those improvements, each of these resources is linked from the press kit. I should also mention that the same caution applies to comparing the 2020 census detailed race data to the American Community Survey, or the ACS estimates. The 2020 census provides the official counts, including Hispanic origin and race, of the population. And the ACS provides estimates of additional characteristics, adding rich context for understanding the nation's population. We implemented these same improvements in the ACS starting in 2020. As a result, use caution when comparing 2020 census detailed Asian, Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander, and American Indian and Alaska Native race data with 2019 or earlier ACS data. We also encourage you to use caution when comparing ancestry data with the ACS and the detailed DHC-B data. The detailed groups classified as white, Black or African American, and some other race available in the 2020 Census detailed DHCA and detailed DHC-B have historically been tabulated from the ancestry question in the ACS. If you compare the ancestry data, keep in mind that they use different methodologies for collecting, coding, and processing data on these two topics. We will provide more details about this in the technical documentation. However, the 2020 census detailed Hispanic origin data from ethnicity questions are comparable with the 2010 census and the ACS, regardless of year. So in terms of geography, the detailed DHC-B will provide data for the nation, states, counties, census tracts, places, think about cities and towns, and American Indian, Alaska Native, and Native Hawaiian areas. However, as I mentioned, the amount of data for a particular group depends on the size of the group and the geography. Larger populations receive more granular statistics for a given geography. Smaller populations receive less granular statistics for a given geography. On the tables we'll talk through in a moment, you'll see that larger groups receive more categories or rows of data in the tables. Smaller groups receive fewer rows or categories in the table. This approach allows the Census Bureau to produce as much detail as possible while ensuring confidentiality protections and that the data meet the Census Bureau's accuracy standards. Let me turn it over to Stephanie and Evan to talk more specifically about what information is available for the two table types and how it differs based on population size and geography. Stephanie?
Thanks, Alexandra. Let's talk about the household type tables first, and I'll give some definitions. The household type tables include a total number of households and, if the group is large enough, breakdowns of the number of family and non-family households. A family household contains at least one person who is related to the householder by birth, marriage, or adoption. A non-family household could be someone living alone or a household in which no one is related to the householder by birth, marriage, or adoption. This information comes from the relationship question on the census form. The census asks each person how they are related to person one, the householder. For example, it could be spouse, unmarried partner, son or daughter, etc. As we'll see in a moment, the table with the most household type information available for the largest groups will also show the number of family households with a spouse present by the sex of the householder. That information comes from the relationship to householder question of the census, as well as the question about person one's sex. Let's talk more specifically about what will be available for groups of different size. The top row of colorful boxes shows the population thresholds at the national or state level. The next row shows the thresholds for sub-state geographies such as counties and tracts. Below each set of thresholds is a shell of the table that would be available for the group of that size at that level of geography. For example, looking at the greenish column on the left, a group with 300 people at the state level would only receive a total household count. Next, in the reddish column, a group of 1,000 people at the county level would receive a table with two categories, the total household count broken out by family households and non-family households. Skipping to the blue column on the right, a group with 20,000 people in a place, think a city or town, would receive the largest table with 8 categories, the total household count, number of family households, and number of non-family households. Within the family households, the table would show the number of married couple family households and other family households. The other family category would show those households with a male householder and no spouse present, and households with a female householder with no spouse present. The non-family household number would show further detail of householders living alone and householders living with others who are not related to them by birth, marriage, or adoption. Now, if you would like to compare household data from 2020 with 2010, one thing to note is that counts of married couple households, family households, and non-family households are affected by the presence of same-sex married couple households in the 2020 census data. So for the 2010 census data products, which were produced before the 2015 Supreme Court decision that legalized same-sex marriage throughout the United States, households reported as same-sex married couple households without children or other relatives present were edited and shown as unmarried partners and included in non-family households unless there was another person present who was related to the householder by birth, marriage, or adoption. For the 2020 census, these households are included in estimates of families because they are married couples. This is also true for the American Community Survey, so these 2020 census data are generally comparable with the ACS data. In addition, the naming conventions for specific household types have been updated in the 2020 census data products to reflect the presence of same-sex married couple households. Labels that previously referred to husband-wife families now refer to married couple families, which include both opposite sex and same-sex married couples. Additionally, labels that previously referred to male householder, no wife present households now refer to male householder, no spouse present. And labels that previously referred to female householder, no husband present households now refer to female householder, no spouse present. The bottom line is that all married couple families are now included in family households in all of the tables. The number of same-sex married couples is relatively small, so this is just something to keep in mind. Now I'll turn it over to Evan to talk about tenure. Evan?
Thanks, Stephanie. When we say tenure, what we mean is whether the home is owned or rented. This information comes from the 2020 census question about the home that asks whether it's owned with a mortgage or loan, owned free and clear, that is without a mortgage or loan, rented, or occupied without payment of rent. The tenure information provided in the detailed DHC-B is pretty straightforward. There are just two table options. The smallest group receives just the total occupied housing unit count. All larger groups receive a tenure table with 3 categories. The slide shows the same population thresholds that Stephanie earlier mentioned, but you'll notice the 3 columns on the right each list 3 categories. Those 3 categories are owned with a mortgage or loan, owned free and clear, and renter occupied. There are no major changes to how the question was asked from 2010. So the 2020 census housing data are generally comparable to the 2010 census and to the American Community Survey. Next, I'll summarize the thresholds that Stephanie and I presented. In the first row, you'll see that the groups at the national or state level with 100 or 470 people or fewer will receive the household type and tenure table that includes just the universe. The larger tables, the group receives a household type table with 2, 6, or 8 categories, and the tenure table, which will always have 3 categories. Now I'll turn it back to Alexandra to walk through some guidance.
Thanks, Evan. We'd like to talk through some things to think about as you use the detailed DHC-B data. Earlier, I mentioned that our approach of providing more granular detail for larger groups in a geography and less granular detail for smaller groups allows us to produce as much detail as possible while ensuring confidentiality protections and that the data meet the Census Bureau's accuracy standards. We call this approach adaptive design. Adaptive design is advantageous because it helps to provide acceptable error for all detailed groups. That's because the same level of noise, the small random additions or subtractions added to the data, it's infused for all detailed groups regardless of size for a given geographic level. So if a detailed group with only 10 households received a full table shell, for example, the full household type table shell with 8 categories, each line would only have 1 or 2 households or maybe even 0 households. When you're adding or subtracting 0, 1, 2, or 3 households to those counts at the nation and state level, the data would not be very accurate. Instead, small detailed groups get smaller table shells or fewer lines, so the noise has a smaller impact on the collected count. Adaptive design helps provide accuracy for all groups, regardless of size. This slide shows the amount of noise added to the household type tables for detailed groups, specifically household type for 8 categories. For detailed groups, the innermost cells of the table have plus or minus 3 for nation and state and plus or minus 11 households for substate geographies like counties and tracts, and for American Indian, Alaska Native, and Native Hawaiian areas. These innermost cells are added up to obtain the subtotal and total lines, which have a little more noise. So for this 8 category household type table, you'll see the most granular rows each have a plus or minus 11 next to them in the substate in American Indian, Alaska Native, and Native Hawaiian areas. So for example, at the county level, this means that the count we publish is within plus or minus 11 of the count we actually collected for that detailed group in that geography at 95% of the time. So if you see that there are 500 people in your group, 500 households in your group living alone in your county, you'll know that the true count is between 489 households and 511 households. The range of accuracy is true regardless of size. For the household type tables with fewer categories, the same plus or minus 11 is true for the most granular lines of those tables. The tenure tables have the same level of noise at the different levels of geography. So for example, let's look at the nation and state column this time for detailed groups. At the nation and state level, the published count is within 3 of the count we actually collected for the group in that geography 95% of the time. If there are 1,000 occupied housing units that own their homes free and clear, you'll know that the true count is between 997 and 1,003 households. That's what we mean when we say noise. Next, let's talk about some guidance as you work with the data. You may have noticed that both the household type and tenure tables include a count of households. The tenure table just uses a different name. It uses occupied housing units. These two numbers likely will not match for a given geography and group. The reason is we infused the statistical noise, those small random additions and subtractions, to the two tables separately. This approach protects the confidentiality of the underlying responses while also providing quality data, but it does cause some inconsistencies in the table. So if you need the total count and they don't match, which should you use? The answer is to use the count from the table with the fewest categories presented. The total count is calculated by adding up the categories in the table, so the more categories, the more statistical noise in that total count. If your group receives the tables with just the total count, choose the table that is most relevant for your household. For you, that would either be the household type or tenure table. Because there aren't any other categories to add up, the total household count has the same level of accuracy between the two types of tables. So let's look at an example. If your group receives the household type table with 2 categories and the tenure table with 3 categories, use the household count from the household type table because it has fewer categories. If your group is larger and it receives a 6 category household type table and a 3 category tenure table, use the total count from the tenure table instead. And same thing here with the largest groups. Use the count from the 3 category tenure table instead of the 8 category household type table. Now, if your group is among the smallest and only receives the tables with the universe or the total household count, choose whichever table is more relevant for you. Again, there aren't any other categories to add up, so the total household count has the same level of accuracy between the two tables. Similarly, you'll find some other inconsistencies. Here are some specific examples. Aggregating geographies and groups within the detailed DHC-B frequently do not match the published count. For example, counties usually do not sum to state totals, and detailed groups usually do not sum to the regional groups. Second, since noise is infused separately to each 2020 census data product, there may be more households for some groups in the detailed DHC-B than there are people in those groups in the detailed DHCA. And third, if you add all the detailed household counts in the detailed DHC-B, it will not match the major race or ethnicity group in the redistricting data summary file or the demographic and housing characteristics file or the DHC. Now, with these situations in mind, we encourage you to consider the following guidance when using the detailed DHC-B data. Don't combine data across the detailed DHCA and the detailed DHC-B to calculate average people per household. The detailed DHCA includes the group quarters population, which should not be included in the people per household calculations. In addition, don't infer missing data by adding or subtracting the published data. These data were suppressed for demographic reasonableness, and so the inferred totals may be unreliable, such as negative numbers. Now for some guidance on what to do. As I mentioned before, use the total household count from the available table with the fewest categories. In addition, use the published counts for the groups and geographies whenever possible, rather than creating custom aggregation, which results in less accurate data. If you do aggregate the smallest number of items possible. So, for example, if data for a custom geographic area can be calculated by summing the data across 10 tracts or subtracting the data for 2 tracts from a county total, Subtracting the data for 2 tracts yields a more accurate result than combining the data across 10 tracts. We will have additional guidance in a brief on disclosure avoidance in the detailed DHC-B and the product's technical documentation. The brief will include a section on guidance on calculating percentages, understanding suppressed counts, comparing to other Census Bureau data sources, and aggregating the detailed DHC-B data. Now, let's turn it back to Stacy to talk about accessing and exploring the data.
Thanks, Alexandra. First, let's talk about the data resources that will be available. The complete set of detailed DHC-B data will be available on the Census Bureau's data.census.gov platform. I'll mention a few tips for navigating to the data on that site in a moment. Data users can use the Census Bureau's Application Programming Interface, or API, to work with large volumes of data. We also heard you following last year's detailed DHC-A release, and we'll make a summary file available to make downloading the data in bulk easier. Of course, you can also download and export the data from data.census.gov. So let's talk about some tips for using data.census.gov. We will have links from our tip sheet and from our press kit that take you into data.census.gov with it already narrowed down to the detailed DHC-B dataset. From there, you'll just need to select the geography and the race or ethnicity groups you're interested in. You'll see a set of menus on the left of the web page where you can select geographies. You'll also see a topics filter. Within the topics filter, select the race and ethnicity option, and then follow the menu to select the groups you would like to find. Selecting the race and ethnicity groups is really key. Otherwise, the tables will default to the first eligible group in the selected geography, and that may not be what you're interested in. Or the table may say data not available when there may actually be data available for your group. The key is you must select the specific race or ethnicity groups you would like to find. I'd also like to emphasize how what my colleagues have shared already relates to what you will see in the search results on data.census.gov. They've emphasized that the amount of data available for a particular group will depend on the group's size for the geography. Evan talked through the thresholds and noted that for each group, you'll receive 1 household type table and 1 tenure table. When you're searching for data on data.census.gov, though, you may see more than 2 tables appear in the search results. However, only 2 tables, 1 household type and 1 tenure table, will show data for a particular group at a particular geography. If other tables are listed in the search results, if you open them, they will say there's no data. It's just the way the site renders for this complex data product, and we wanted you to be aware of it. We will have resources available that should do a much better job than what I just did, explaining how to find the data. We'll have short videos with examples. We'll also have how-to guides, basically PDF documents with screenshots and some instructions. These will talk about using data.census.gov. They'll also address using the API. If any of this is confusing, please feel free to reach out to us and we can help walk you through it. I'll give our contact information in a few moments. We'll also host another webinar on August 6th, entirely dedicated to walking you through finding the data on data.census.gov. The technical documentation will also include some examples. Which brings me to a list of the technical resources. We'll have technical documentation. This includes more detailed explanations and examples of some of the topics we've covered today. We're working to make that available as soon as possible before the public release. We're working on a brief that describes the disclosure avoidance methodology used to protect the detailed DHC-B and how the similarities and differences compared with how we protected last year's detailed DHC-A. The brief will also provide guidance for data users. The next 3 items on the list here, the iterations list, the code list, and the race and ethnicity crosswalk, will help you understand the groups available in the detailed DHC-B. The iterations list lists all the groups. The code list shows how we got to those groups by coding people's responses. And the race and ethnicity crosswalk shows you how that changed from 2010. Those 3 items are available in the press kit now. The final item, the product planning crosswalk, is also available on the press kit. It shows the table shelves for the product, what those rows of data will look like. And again, it depends on the size of the group and the geography. The final set of resources I'll mention today covers the content that will be available. Today or later this afternoon, we'll publish a blog that recaps and summarizes what we've talked about during today's webinar. During the embargo period, and then on release day, we'll have a tip sheet that points you to the data set. Similarly, we're working on an America Counts story that examines the detailed race and ethnicity of owner-occupied households nationally and by states. Before we move to questions, let me recap the timing and logistics. The data will be available on embargo beginning around 10 a.m. Tuesday, July 30th. We'll lift the embargo at 12:01 a.m. Eastern Time on Thursday, August 1st. The news release will go live on our website at 12:01 a.m. and we expect the data to be live on data.census.gov by 10 a.m. If you would like to register for embargo access, I dropped the link in the chat earlier. And also they'll take you to the login page. So if you're already a subscriber, so please note that you must be accredited media and must abide by the embargo policy to have that access. So now let's take your questions. Alexandra, Stephanie, Evan, and I are joined by some additional subject matter experts that we may call upon to help answer your questions. If you've been using the Q&A feature to ask your question, thank you. Our team has been trying to answer those along the way. And if we haven't answered your question already, we may try to answer it out loud now. If you would like to ask your question verbally, use the raise hand feature and we'll call on you in the order in which hands are raised. Then please unmute yourself once you are prompted. When you ask your question, please state your name and media affiliation or your organization. And because we want to give everyone an opportunity to ask their questions, we'll allow just one question and one follow-up. If we can't get to your question today or you have others following the webinar, please reach out to the Public Information Office, either by email at pio@census.gov or by phone at 301-763-3030. So while we wait for our first question, I'd like to highlight our data dissemination and training program. If you're looking for further assistance on how to obtain or understand census data, our data dissemination specialists, or DDSs as we call them, are located across the country and they can help provide assistance. These specialists usually provide help in English, but sometimes help is available in other languages as well. Whether conducting one-on-one webinars with business startups or conducting large-scale presentations at universities, these specialists strive to put the public in touch with the data they need. DDSs provide a wide variety of assistance for free. If you're interested in a specific type of training or presentation, please reach out to a specialist in your area using the contact information on the slide. So let me check our Q&A. All right, I don't think I see anyone's hands raised at the moment. Anthony, help me out if I'm just missing someone's hand raised. So let's take a look at the questions in the chat so far. Allie, I know you've been helping us answer quite a few. Are there any that we need to answer out loud?
Yeah, Stacy, we've had a few questions regarding when or where rather the webinar transcript and slides will be available from what you're showing today.
That is a great question. Thank you for that. Let me drop a link in the chat to our press kit. We will post the recording hopefully by later this week, and the transcript that may take a little additional time, or actually this might be about the same time. I'm putting it in the wrong spot. Sorry, bear with me. Dropping this in the chat. So we will post that hopefully by later this week in that press kit that I just dropped in the chat. All right, how about other questions, Allie? Are you seeing any others we need to talk out loud?
We have a few questions in the chat about the SDHC, which isn't on topic necessarily for today's webinar. I don't know if anyone just has a comment or two about that upcoming release.
That is something that we are working on, and we've announced the release dates for that. It's for September. Let me not get ahead of myself. Alexandra or Evan, I know you two are working on that release. Anything that's worth mentioning briefly about that? I don't want to veer us too far off topic from today's discussion.
I can talk a little bit about the averages with the question. So for the detailed DHC-B, it's just the household population, and the detailed DHCA is both the household population and the group quarters population. It's the total population. So We will not have the average household size for the detailed race and ethnicity groups, but the supplemental demographic and housing characteristics file, or the SDHC, will include averages for total population, like for the household population, and it will also include that iterated by the major race and ethnicity categories. So if you're familiar with our table shells, we usually call those iterations A through I. And the SDHC will be available at the nation state. So that's where you can find those averages. We can also put in the chat a fact sheet about some of the average guidance that we've released already.
And that SDHC product is scheduled for release on September 19th. So stay tuned for more information as we get closer to that as well. So if you do have a question, don't feel shy about raising your hand. Hopefully you see the little raise hand feature in the lower corner, or perhaps at the bottom, depends on your screen layout. So feel free to raise your hand and we'd be happy to call on you and try to answer those questions. So I do see a question about, will the regional groups have the same margins of error in the B file as they did in the A file? Alexandra, would you like to take that one?
Yeah, the margins of error for the regional groups will be the same as detailed DHCA. That's plus or minus 50 for all geographies. So nation, state, the sub-state geographies, and the American Indian, Alaska Native, and Native Hawaiian areas.
Great, thank you for that. All right, well, we wait.
And I should have mentioned, sorry,
yeah,
Stacey, I should have mentioned that the how the margins of error are set up, they are hitting a 95% confidence interval. And that 95% is also the same for detailed DHCA and detailed DHC-B. If you've been following along with us, when we released the proof of concept in January of 2024, you would have seen a 90% confidence interval for detailed DHC-B, but based on data user feedback, we were able to bump that up to 95% to match detailed DHCA. And that is for the detailed groups and the regional groups.
Allie, are you seeing any other questions in the chat that we should address out loud too?
No, Stacey, that was the last question in the chat as of right now.
Okay, great. Well, I'll stall for just another moment in case anyone else has any other questions. And I'd just like to highlight a few other upcoming releases. On Thursday, we'll release the new data from the Small Area Health Insurance Estimate Program. So that'll be coming out Thursday, July 25th. And then on Friday, July 26th, the 2030 Census Advisory Committee will hold its summer virtual meeting. And this will be the first meeting of the 2030 Census Advisory Committee, and folks will be able to listen in to those proceedings. All right, well, we won't keep going. You have our contact information. We'll share that again here on the screen. We'll go ahead and wrap up today, but if you do have other questions following today's webinar or during next week, once you start seeing the data and are trying to access it via embargo, or want to see the public release, please feel free to reach out to us. Again, the Public Information Office, we're available at 301-763-3030 or by email at pio@census.gov. Or if you have more general questions, please feel free to call our customer service center. So thanks to everyone who joined us and to our presenters, Alexandra, Stephanie, and Evan. We plan to post the recording by the end of the week, and you can find the slides available now from our press kit. And a special thanks to data users, tribal leaders, and other stakeholders who provided input over the last decade. With their input, we believe you'll find that the detailed DHC-B data offer a rich source of information about the nation's race and ethnicity groups and tribal nations. We look forward to continued engagement in the years to come as we continuously improve how we measure race and ethnicity. And we look forward to next week's release and to your use of these data. Finally, we ask that you fill out the evaluation form that will appear once you exit the webinar. We want to ensure that these sessions are helpful to you. Thank you and good day.